Obviously, Cuban Americans have had a major interest over the years in foreign policy, in particular, or how a president will conduct policy towards the island of Cuba. That has been a determinant and consistent factor over the last 50 years.
And according to Professor Gamarra, travel and remittance restrictions are the #1 concern for Cuban Americans.
While a majority of Cuban Americans still believe that the embargo should be maintained, there is an increasing number of people who want to change, a significant change in U.S. policy toward Cuba. One of the big issues that has become increasingly divisive among Cuban Americans is the whole question of who can visit the island, who can send money back to the island, and what are the guidelines that are going to determine the deepness of the relationship that a person can have with his or her family back on the island.
Camila Gallardo from the Cuban American Foundation agrees.
The embargo, obviously, we support. We helped craft the laws that currently make up the embargo, but the part of the policy that would help precipitate a real change in Cuba has been missing. And what I mean by that, or how we define it, is help to human rights activists and political opposition groups on the island. I'll give you an example. Prior to 2004, you would be able to send money, $300 a quarter, to any family member in Cuba. Now what they've done basically is they've redefined what family is considered, and so now it's nuclear family. And as you know, with Hispanic groups, whether they're Cuban, Mexican, Puerto Rican, our extended family is an important part of our family, or we consider it a nuclear family. Some people are raised by aunts or uncles or second cousins, and so restricting the ability for us to send them humanitarian aid in the form of cash or whatever it may be, which actually helps them become independent of the communist state, has been a real problem under the current regulations.
And after giving their vote to President Obama in November, Cuban Americans do expect him to take charge and change these policies. But as Professor Gamarra states, it's not just up to him.
But what's important to remember is that change in U.S. foreign policy doesn't occur because the president says change is possible. It's because you have to look at how that president will work with Congress, because Congress in the end holds the key to foreign policy.
But after all the impositions from the last administrations, these voters are eager for change and are looking for Obama to deliver his promise and make it happen.
The way the current policy works right now is it restricts my ability to play a role in the freedom of Cuba in the future as a Cuban American, and I think I should have that right, and so should my mom. My mom should be able to visit her family freely, and that's the only way we can bring about change in Cuba. So I think with an Obama administration, you'll see working toward the cause of freedom in Cuba much more effectively than what you've seen in the last 8 years.
Well, talking about Cuba, I have a question from one of our audience, and it comes from Martin Sanchez from Brooklyn, New York. And Dan, maybe you can answer that question. It says, creating openness for U.S. tourists to enter freely into Cuba, is that the base metric to ensuring that Cuba is really a progressive society? This is a question that is coming from one of the people from our audience.
Mm. Well, I think that the answer is basically that the United States, whenever it seeks an outcome in Cuba, a political outcome in Cuba, it tends to get the opposite. And I'm not sure that whether restricting travel or allowing travel to Cuba is going to be a force for democratic change on the island. I think more broadly, though, that the U.S. government should get out of the business of regulating travel to Cuba. It's the only country that U.S. citizens are banned from traveling to. Clearly, it hasn't done much to promote democracy on the island. And I think that what you probably need to see, if you want to see change in Cuba, is a broader range of engagement from a range of actors in U.S. society and a range of actors in Cuban society.
How about the embargo?
I think it's a Cold War relic that should be also lifted. I mean, it hasn't accomplished any of the supposed goals of promoting democracy in Cuba, and it serves as an excuse for the regime in Havana to portray the United States as an aggressor and to blame the economic situation on the blockade, as they call it. So I think that it should also be lifted because it is not accomplishing what it's supposed to.
Well,
Adolfo, you are disagreeing with
I
it.
completely disagree. I think I agree with President Obama. We should maintain the embargo on Cuba, as he said during his campaign that he would do so. I do want to correct your video here. The vast majority of Cuban Americans voted for John McCain for president, not Barack Obama. I think they're referring to Hispanic votes. It's 82%. So that's the vast majority. The embargo should be maintained. Of course, it is our law. It's something that President Clinton signed into law, and it's for strengthen the embargo actually 12 years ago. It should be maintained. It is the right policy. It is the right moral policy. It's the policy to bring about, continue to bring pressure on an illegitimate regime.
The promise has not worked for 50 years. What do we do?
Well,
what do we do so that we have real
You know,
results?
the same voices today that are advocating for change in Cuba because the policy hasn't worked were the voices, I'm dating myself here, were the voices of the 1970s that were saying that this was the age of the Soviet Union and we needed to reach an accommodation with the Soviets because 70 years of policy, longer than Cuba, were not yielding fruit in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. The fact of the matter is, and the viewers should know this, tourism and contacts did not bring about change in Eastern Europe or the Soviet Union. It was the persistent, strong policy of the United States to continue to put pressure on those regimes that brought about change. There is no empirical evidence ever that tourism or contacts have brought about change in either an authoritarian society or totalitarian society. What it will do, it will strengthen the Castro regime by having more revenues come into Cuba and provide a safety valve. So it is a way to prop up the regime. So if we want to further the regime of the Castro regime, that is a way to do it, is by more contact with Cuba and more dollars going to the country.